In this video, we're going to consider the topic of lexical aspect, or what's sometimes called Aktionsart, using the German word. We'll be looking at how we infer certain things about the timing of action from the verbs that are used and the context we put those words into. The idea is that we put situations into different groups in our minds based on this timing of the action. And most of the material here is based on a few pages from Paul Krager's book, Analyzing Meaning, but you can also read more about it in Van Velen and Apollo's book from 1997, Syntax. It's got a few more pages there, a bit more of an in-depth discussion, and both of these will point you back to some of the more original works if you really want to dig into these ideas. This is the objectives then of what we're going to try and cover. We're going to talk about how you can use tests to identify whether verbs or situation types are stative or dynamic, whether they're states or events, whether they're telic or atelic, whether they are durative or punctual. And we'll come across, explain the definitions of these as we go along. And then we're going to talk about how you can identify the lexical aspect of verbs and events according to 5 different categories, whether they are states, activities, achievements, accomplishments, or semelfactives. And again, we'll define these as the session goes on. But I wanted to begin with an example. I was driving in the car listening to Classic FM, and I heard somebody sending in their request for a piece of song, and they said, "I'm writing my PhD thesis this afternoon." Now, I want to ask, does that sound at all unusual to you in some respects? It was written in the morning. I was listening to this in the car in the morning, and the person said, "I'm writing my PhD thesis this afternoon." If it sounds unusual, why is that? To me, it sounds like if the person is saying this in the morning, they say they're going to be starting and completing their PhD thesis in just one afternoon, that by the end of the afternoon, the thesis will be written. That is, it sounds like they think writing a PhD thesis is something that can be measured out as you progress through it. And if you're doing it this afternoon, it suggests that you are measuring out that whole activity in this time frame. I don't know if that's just me. There are other words that we could use as well. Let's see if they have the same effect. Someone says, "I'm editing my PhD thesis this afternoon." Do you think they will have completed it in the time frame or not? Or, "I'm proofreading my PhD thesis this afternoon." Again, that's something that can be completed. Does it suggest they will have completed it by the end of the afternoon or not? They say, "I'm working on my PhD thesis this afternoon," though. Maybe that feels a little bit different. That's not inherently bounded. It's not something that needs to be finished. How about if someone says, "I'm loving my PhD thesis this afternoon"? Well, I think if they're saying this in the morning, this just doesn't make sense. You can't say, "I'm loving my PhD thesis this afternoon." It can't be used for a future event. If it's written in the afternoon, you could have that, "I'm loving my PhD thesis," but then it's sort of viewing it as an activity rather than the fact that you love it. You could love your PhD thesis, but saying, "I'm loving my PhD thesis," sounds a little bit strange. So the point is there are some different words here, and when we use these different words, these examples show that our minds can infer something about aspectual distinction, whether something is completed or continuous, from the different verbs and the way they occur in utterances. That is, we might infer that something is completed or not, or that something happened continuously or repeatedly. And we're going to look at this issue now as we consider ways to group verbs into different classes according to this lexical aspect, the aspect based on the word itself, or what's sometimes called Aktionsart. And we're going to look at the words used to talk about these differences. For example, we will say that writing my PhD thesis is an accomplishment because it has an inherent endpoint, whereas working on my PhD thesis is an activity because it does not have an endpoint. But before we come to this idea of things being completed, let's look in more detail at different kinds of situations there might be in the world. So at this stage, we're going to think about two very broad kinds of situation types, and we're going to think about the real world rather than about language. And we're going to say there might be two main different types of situations: states or events. So a state is a situation in which nothing happens. One way of thinking about this is to imagine you're taking a video of a state. You take a video of a state, it just looks the same as if you took a snapshot or a still photo of that state. Nothing happens. Or to put it more complexly, we could say states are homogeneous over time. Typically, states are things like participants in locations, for example, a book on a table. That doesn't change over time. Or somebody who is in a condition, for example, a boy who is tired. Or states might refer to internal experiences, a girl who knows something. Any of these, if you took a video of them, you would not see anything happening. Events, on the other hand, are situations in which something happens. If you took a video of them, you'd see something that's more than just a still snapshot. Or we might say events are internally complex. We can think of examples like a horse running, or a balloon popping, or ice melting. In all of these events, something is happening. So we infer whether something is being construed as a state or event from the words a speaker uses in their utterance. We expect certain verbs or expressions to evoke states and others to evoke events, and we can use certain tests to show which category we put certain verbs into. Now, in all the tests that we're going to cover in this video, notice that they are designed for English. You'd need to use different tests in other languages, or you might need to at least check whether there are similar tests that will work. So here's a first test for trying to see whether something is a state or an event. Firstly, only events can answer the question, what happened? So you ask someone what happened, and they can say, what happened was Mary kissed the bishop. That makes sense. So kissing the bishop is an event. Similarly, if you say what happened, so what happened was the sun set. Therefore, setting, the sun setting is an event. But if I say what happened was, and the answer is William had 3 older brothers, that's not a valid answer to what happened. That's not a sentence that makes sense. I can't say what happened was George loved sauerkraut. It's going to be quite hard to find a context in which that actually makes sense. So having brothers and loving sauerkraut are not events, they are states. Another test, test number 2, is that we can tell something is an event because it has a natural interpretation with the progressive ing. And there's maybe some question around here, what does a natural interpretation mean? It's some kind of prototypical normal interpretation. So Mary is kissing the bishop. That makes sense. Something that's happening right now. The sun is setting. Well, that's something that happens right now. So these are events that make sense. But if I say William is having 3 older brothers, it's hard to make much sense of that. Or George is loving sauerkraut. There's not a very natural interpretation of that, unless we view loving as some kind of activity where he's really getting stuck into his sauerkraut right now. So there is this possible interpretation, particularly of the verb love. And so we have things like George is loving all the attention, which does make sense, even though it's perhaps not the natural interpretation with the suffix ing on it. And here's a third test for events and states. In English, we infer a habitual interpretation for events in the simple present, whereas states describe the situation now. So if you've got an event, we've already had these events here about kissing the bishop and the sun setting, and we put those into the English simple present. So this might not work in other languages. Then we get this habitual interpretation. If we say Mary kisses the bishop, it can't mean something that's true right now. it's talking about something that happens perhaps every Sunday. Or if we say the sun sets, it's not talking about what's happening right now. It's talking about something that's happening habitually, like the sun sets every evening. Whereas if we have a state and put it into the simple present, William has 3 brothers, that makes sense for something that is happening now and ongoing. It doesn't change. Or Mary loves the bishop. This is something that is happening now and ongoing. So examples 3 and 4 here are states, whereas examples 1 and 2 are events. So in this session, we're going to build up some technical names for different types of situations. Again, this word Aktionsart is what we'll use. And for now, we've discovered the type called states, which are different to the broad category of events. And we've got states like having, loving, knowing, and events like running, popping, melting, kissing. And we're going to explore this category in a little more detail now. So another distinction that is helpful is the difference between durative situations and punctiliar situations. Durative situations are construed as taking place over a time interval. Think of things like singing, walking, or reading. Punctiliar situations, on the other hand, are construed as happening in an instant, knocking, blinking, recognizing someone, finding something. They don't have a duration to them. So how could you test to check your intuition as to whether a verb is describing a durative event or a punctiliar event? Well, one test is that verbs describing durative events can occur naturally with pace adverbs like slowly, whereas punctiliar verbs do not. So we can say Barry walked slowly, that seems very natural. Josh read slowly, that seems very natural. But we don't normally think of punctiliar events as happening slowly. The tower exploded slowly, seems rather unusual. Barry coughed slowly. Can we make sense of that? Josh recognized people slowly. These aren't normal, these are harder to process than things like Barry walked slowly or Josh read slowly. So it seems like they're in a different category. These are what we might think of as punctiliar events. Another test for punctiliar events is trying to put them into the progressive ing form. And if they're a punctiliar event, either it doesn't work or we infer an iterative interpretation when we put them with the ing ending on the end of them. So Barry is coughing. It's not just like one long cough. Barry is coughing suggests it is happening repeatedly, many coughs, one after each other. Josh is recognizing people. It's not that he's slowly recognizing who people are, although you could imagine a situation in which that happens. He's waking up for a dream and he's suddenly beginning to recognize that people are people rather than trees. But normally, if you read Josh is recognizing people, it would suggest he is spotting one person after another. Whereas Barry is walking or Josh is reading, this is just one activity that's taking a long period of time. So walking and reading are durative, whereas coughing and recognizing are punctiliar. When we put them into the ing form, they have an iterative interpretation. They happen several times over. So adding these to our chart, we can see now we've got states and events separated, and within events, we can have durative events and punctiliar events. Now, we're only showing the distinctions between durative and punctiliar on the event side because states are always durative. They always have inherent duration. You cannot have a punctiliar state. The next important distinction between situation types is between telic and atelic situations. So what are these? Telic events are those that have a natural endpoint and they can be measured out in their progression towards that endpoint. And they may be measured out by a number of different ways. They may be measured out by a participant that changes state. For example, ice melting, or a house that is being built, or clothes that are drying. Or they may be measured out by a participant that doesn't change state. If I'm reading a novel, it's measured out by how far through that novel I have got. We can say I'm halfway through reading the novel, or I have finished reading the novel. Or they may be measured out by movement towards a destination. For example, a run towards the park has a telic endpoint when I reach the park. On the other hand, we have atelic situations which have no natural endpoint, like shivering, walking, spinning. If I'm just spinning, there is no natural way when I'm going to stop. Here are a few more examples to show that when we're thinking about words, often the phrases or the objects that are associated with a verb can impact the telicity of a situation. So Ben ate pizzas is not telic. He can go on eating pizzas for as long as he likes. There's no inherent measuring out this eating of pizzas. But if we say Ben ate a ham and pineapple pizza, it is telic. There is an endpoint. The endpoint is when he has finished eating the pizza. Similarly, Anna sang songs in English. This is atelic. It can go on forever. She can be continuously singing songs in English. But Anna sang the English national anthem. It is telic. Now we've specified a particular song that she's singing. It has a beginning. It has a progress through it. So she could be halfway through singing the national anthem, and she could have finished singing the national anthem. So this is a telic situation. Similarly, Emma swam for 3 hours. This is atelic, whereas Emma swam across the English Channel. This is measured by her journey across the channel, and it does have a telic endpoint to it when she has crossed the channel. Similarly, with Matthew ran in the park, it's atelic. He can do that forever, whereas Matthew ran to the park, it has an inherent endpoint at the point he reaches the park. And you can see here it's things to do with these prepositional phrases, like the difference between 3 hours, or in the park versus to the park, that give us this idea of whether a situation is something that is telic or atelic. So what are some tests for telicity? How might we check whether something is a telic event or an atelic event? Well, one way is a description of a telic event can naturally be modified by a time phrase expressing a temporal boundary. That is a time when it needs to be done by, but not by duration of time. So here's an example with a temporal boundary time phrase in 10 minutes. We can say Susan found her pet iguana in 10 minutes. Suggests that finding an iguana is a telic activity because it can be done within a time frame. Whereas we can't say Susanna found her pet iguana for 10 minutes. That just doesn't sound good in English because it's a telic event, and for 10 minutes is only works with something that is atelic. So yeah, on the other hand, a description of an atelic event can naturally be modified by a time phrase that expresses duration, like for 10 minutes, but not with a temporal boundary. So example, we can't say Anna sang songs in English in 10 minutes. That doesn't sound natural in English. Whereas we can say Anna sang songs in English for 10 minutes. That's because singing is an atelic activity. So looking at our diagram, now that we have this final distinction, we can give names to 5 different types of situations. We've already had states mentioned. Now we're looking at the events again. And first, for durative events, they can be either telic with an endpoint, like ice melting or writing a book. And these are called accomplishments. Something is completed at the end. On the other hand, if we have a durative activity that is atelic, there's no endpoint. It's something that can just carry on going. And these are called activities. Situations like walking, singing, spinning are all technically activities in this model. And finally, we can see the same distinction between 2 types of punctiliar situations. Some of them are telic, like recognize, explode, or die, there's a clear endpoint when something has exploded, died, or been recognized. In each case, something has changed state, and these are called achievements. On the other hand, we can have atelic punctiliar events, and these have been called semelfactives, which is maybe a new word. This is something that is conceived of as happening instantaneously, but that doesn't change state. Events like coughing, blinking, tapping. These are the kind of events where if you say, for example, John coughed for an hour, you are most likely to infer an iterative interpretation, as he coughed many times rather than coughing for an hour being one long cough that took an hour. And this contrasts with the durative events, that's the activities, like John sang for an hour, which doesn't have an iterative interpretation. So you can use these 5 words, states, accomplishments, activities, achievements, and semelfactives, to try and classify different verbs and the situation types they are describing. But a final word of caution, this is a very nice diagram, but once you try to apply it to real texts and utterances, you will probably find many words are in grey areas and it's harder to apply than you might think. And one of the complexities comes from needing to think very carefully about which world we think these actions, art descriptions apply to. Are they features of situations in the real world? Gregor's describing them as situation types in the real world. Or are they features of words within the world of symbols, since we've been testing for them by using linguistic tests like in an hour or for an hour and putting these words next to other words and seeing does it make sense or not? Well, presumably not. Presumably they are actually categories in the world of our minds, if they exist anywhere. They're our mental representations of events, either as we perceive them in the world or as they're described in texts. And if so, we need to remember, as with all our topics in semantics and pragmatics, there is a complicated inferential relationship between the world of the text and our cognitive world. The words always underdetermine meaning, and our minds always work through inferential processes based on context. So have fun exploring this. See where you get. See if you can work out what your mind is doing when you hear descriptions of events and how you might be processing utterances to infer whether something is an activity, a state, or a semelfactive, and think about whether you ever have miscommunication based on inferring the wrong lexical aspect when someone is speaking to you. Enjoy.